The first weeks after the German surrender were a blur of disbelief and exhaustion. All across the shattered continent, trains full of displaced people moved through landscapes that looked like the end of the world. Villages flattened to dust, fields littered with rusted helmets and abandoned tanks, rivers choked with the debris of cities. The war had ended, but the peace had not yet begun. Among the millions of prisoners gathered in makeshift camps run by the Allies were not only soldiers but women, nurses, clerks, secretaries, communication operators, and auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht, who had served the Third Reich in its dying months. To them, captivity was supposed to mean punishment. Yet what they were about to experience would dismantle everything they had ever been taught about power, race, and civilization itself. Liesl Miller was 26 years old when the war ended. Her hands were still scarred from disinfectants, her eyes hollow from years of sleepless nights in bomb shelters and hospital tents. She had worked in field hospitals from the Eastern Front to Bavaria, patching up men who no longer resembled men at all. She had seen enough blood to know that the human body, no matter its nationality, bled the same color, and yet, like most Germans of her generation, she had grown up in a world where difference was forbidden to be neutral. Race, blood, and obedience had been the pillars of her upbringing. She had memorized speeches about purity in school, sung songs about destiny in the Hitler Youth, and believed that the Reich's order was unshakable. But by 1945 everything had collapsed. Her country, her family, her faith in the invincibility of her leader. When the Allied troops took her prisoner near Munich, Liesl expected vengeance. She had heard the stories whispered by retreating soldiers. Allied revenge, Soviet atrocities, women shaved bald, prisoners starved or shot. So when she and several dozen other women were herded onto a train marked PW for prisoner of war, she braced herself for the worst. The journey lasted 3 days. They passed through lands that no longer looked German or French, just broken, burned-out towns, children scavenging through rubble, the smell of dead horses along the rails. In the cramped boxcar, the women barely spoke. Some clutched their small Red Cross armbands as if those white bands could save them. On the third morning, the train slowed. The women pressed against the tiny barred window. They saw rolling fields, tents, barbed wire, and rows of American soldiers standing near wooden guard towers. Beyond them, banners of the United States Army fluttered in the wind. The women whispered nervously, "They say Americans hate Germans," one muttered. "But they hate the blacks even more," said another, parroting propaganda that had been drilled into her for years. "Maybe they make them do the worst work," a third added, trying to sound superior even in defeat. Liesl said nothing. She only watched as the train came to a halt, and the soldiers approached. The doors clanked open, and sunlight flooded the car. The women blinked, shielding their eyes. Commands rang out in English, firm but not cruel. "Out, one by one. Leave your things for inspection." Liesl stepped down, her boots crunching on gravel. The air smelled of soap and roasted coffee, a strange comfort after years of gunpowder. Then she froze. At the front of the line stood a black American soldier, tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform immaculate. His name tag read Turner. He was laughing with a white sergeant, passing a cigarette back and forth. They stood shoulder to shoulder like old friends, sharing a joke. The sight struck Liesl harder than any shell. In Germany she had seen men like Turner only in caricatures. Monsters on propaganda posters. Inferiors, said to corrupt civilization. Yet here he was. Not a slave or a servant, but a soldier of the victorious army, and, more than that, the white sergeant beside him seemed to treat him as an equal. They laughed together. They smoked together. When a truck rolled by, both stepped aside at the same time, neither giving nor taking command in that moment. It was an image Liesl's mind could not reconcile. Inside the camp, the women were processed and separated. They were issued khaki work clothes, and given bunks inside wooden barracks. Guards patrolled, but there was no shouting, no beating. The rations were meager but edible. Bread, beans, coffee that tasted foreign but strong. The rules were clear: no stealing, no escape attempts, no political talk. Most of the guards were young Americans, some curious, some indifferent. What stunned Liesl most was how orderly and humane it all felt. For years she had seen Germany treat prisoners with contempt. Here the victors treated their captives with a dignity that unsettled her more than cruelty would have. The next morning, as the prisoners lined up for roll call, the same black soldier from the gate was there. He stood with a clipboard, reading names in a calm southern drawl. Miller, Miller, Liesl, Miller. She hesitated, startled to hear her name pronounced correctly. Yes, she replied quickly. He glanced up, met her eyes for a second, and nodded. You're assigned to kitchen duty, he said. Report after breakfast. There was no hostility in his tone, only routine professionalism. In the kitchen tent later that day, Lucille watched him move between tables, checking supplies. The white and black soldiers worked side by side, handing each other pots, joking in a mix of slang she didn't understand. When the meals were served, the same men sat together at long benches, black soldiers and white soldiers eating from the same bowls, passing salt and bread without hesitation. It was such a simple act, yet for someone raised under the Reich's laws it was almost incomprehensible. In her mind, races were not supposed to mix, not supposed to share, but here it was, in front of her eyes, the collapse of everything she had believed about order and purity. Later that evening she wrote in a small notebook she had kept hidden throughout the war. I saw something today that I cannot explain, she wrote in careful, slanted handwriting. They eat together, Negros and whites. They treat each other as comrades. It makes me wonder what else I have been lied to about. Over the next few days the camp settled into rhythm. The German women scrubbed laundry, peeled potatoes, cleaned tents and carried water. The American guards rotated shifts, sometimes chatting with prisoners in broken German. The war was fresh in everyone's mind. But here the fighting was replaced by something quieter. Curiosity. One afternoon, a group of women was assigned to help unload medical crates near the infirmary. Liesel worked beside another nurse, Ingi, who whispered under her breath about the Negro guards with nervous disdain. Don't look at them too long, she muttered. They say they're dangerous. Lucille didn't answer. She had seen danger. It looked nothing like these men. When a soldier dropped a crate near her, she heard him swear softly. The same black corporal, Turner, stepped forward and helped him lift it again. Easy now, he said. Then he turned to Lucille, and noticing the fear in her eyes, smiled faintly. Don't worry, ma'am. We don't bite. His tone carried humor, not mockery. It disarmed her completely. That night, lying in her bunk, Liesel thought about the expression on his face. It wasn't the arrogance of a conqueror. It was weariness, the kind she had seen in soldiers who had survived too much. She wondered where he came from. What kind of place produced a man who could fight for a country that still treated him unequally? She had overheard another guard mention that some of the black soldiers had fought in the Battle of the Bulge, that their unit, the 721st Tank Battalion, had faced some of the toughest resistance in Europe. The irony was unbearable. These men who had helped defeat her nation were still not treated as equals in their own homeland. Yet they carried themselves with more grace than most of the officers she had ever known. Days turned into weeks. The propaganda-fed hatred that once simmered in the German prisoners began to dissolve into confusion. Then introspection. Some women whispered that the Americans were trying to humiliate them by treating them well. Others said the Americans' kindness was proof of their superiority. But Lucille felt something deeper: shame. Not from defeat but from realization. The world she had lived in had been built on lies about human worth. And the truth was standing in front of her, wearing an American uniform, sharing bread with another man whose skin was a different shade. When rain came, the camp turned muddy. The women were issued ponchos to keep dry. Turner passed them out, making sure everyone had one. When one woman refused to take hers from his hand, he set it down gently on a crate beside her without saying a word. Liesel watched the scene, her heart twisting. Later she asked him, "Why do you not get angry when they act so proud?" He looked at her with tired eyes and said, "Because anger don't change a thing, ma'am. I've been called worse by folks who speak my own language." The calm truth in his words silenced her completely. For the first time she understood what humility looked like when it was stronger than pride. The following morning, Lucille was sent to the infirmary to assist an American doctor. She cleaned instruments, bandaged minor injuries, and distributed pills to soldiers and prisoners alike. It was there she saw something else that startled her. A white officer shaking hands with a black sergeant over a successful operation. The gesture was brief but real. She caught herself staring again, thinking of her own father, who had fought in the First World War and once told her that racial purity was what kept Germany strong. Now, looking at these men who had defeated the Reich, she realized purity had done nothing but destroy them all. At night, the sound of a radio drifted through the camp. The Americans played music, unlike anything Liesel had heard before. Jazz, swing, blues. It had rhythm, emotion, freedom. The black soldiers often clapped their hands or hummed along. The white soldiers joined them, laughing, stomping their boots to the beat. The sound was infectious, alive, and for a few moments the camp no longer felt like a prison. Liesl wrote again in her notebook. Their music sounds like forgiveness. In the following weeks, she began to notice small gestures that spoke louder than any propaganda. How Turner would share his coffee with another guard. How they'd sit together under the same tarp during rain. How they'd argue playfully about baseball or home without bitterness. For a woman who had been told her whole life that race defined worth, it was a revelation. She began to question not only her beliefs but the very roots of her identity. She thought about her mother, who had once warned her never to speak to anyone unfit. She thought about the boys she had known in uniform, all swallowed by the war they believed was righteous, and she thought about the faces she had seen in the hospital tents. Russian, Polish, German, all identical in agony. Maybe the Americans had learned something her people never had, that equality wasn't a weakness but a strength. Each night she tried to make sense of the contradiction. How a nation that allowed racial segregation at home could still show this unity abroad. It confused her, but it also gave her hope. If men could share a table here after so much hate, maybe there was still something in the world worth saving. The war had taken her home, her brothers and her faith in authority. But in that camp under the watch of soldiers who defied everything she had been told to fear, Liesl began to sense something unfamiliar blooming quietly inside her. Respect. For the first time in years she no longer felt proud of being German. She felt proud simply to be human. The rain had settled into the soil by the second month of captivity, turning the paths between the barracks into slick veins of mud. The women learned to walk carefully, holding their rations close, boots caked in brown earth. To most it still felt strange to be alive, to be prisoners yet unharmed, to hear laughter instead of orders. Even the guards seemed to carry a strange gentleness, as if the war had burned out every taste for cruelty. Liesl had stopped counting the days. She measured time instead by the rhythm of daily chores, dawn roll call, morning work, afternoon rest. Her hands, though rough and chapped, found small peace in routine. But more than anything she watched the men who guarded them, the soldiers whose behavior defied every law she had grown up believing. The Americans, black and white, shared cigarettes, tools and jokes, like the divisions of her old world meant nothing here. Each morning Turner stood near the supply tent with his clipboard, greeting every worker as they passed. Some prisoners still refused to look him in the eye. Others did so with curiosity or discomfort, unsure how to behave toward a man they had once been told did not belong in uniform. Turner never forced words from anyone. He simply did his job with quiet precision. A man who seemed to understand the weight of patience better than most generals. When Liesl walked by, he always nodded politely, saying, "Morning, ma'am," in that soft southern tone. It was a greeting simple and human, yet powerful in its normality. For a woman raised to fear and despise difference, such moments broke something inside her, something made of stone. The first time she was assigned to clean the infirmary, she found herself working near him again. The air smelled of disinfectant and wet cloth. He carried boxes of bandages from one corner to another, humming under his breath. The tune was unfamiliar, slow, mournful, beautiful. Liesl dared to ask, "What song is that?" Turner looked up, surprised that she spoke to him directly. "It's a church hymn," he said. "My mama used to sing it." He went back to his task. She hesitated, wanting to ask more, but fear of sounding foolish held her tongue. When he finished, he nodded again before leaving. That night she couldn't sleep. She thought about his mother, about what kind of woman raised a son capable of such calm. Did she know he was here, watching over the people who once considered him subhuman? Liesl couldn't imagine such forgiveness existing in her world. A few days later, an incident shattered the fragile quiet of the camp. A young German woman named Irma, who had worked in communications during the war, shouted at one of the guards when her work assignment changed. Her anger boiled over. Her pride still burned. When Turner approached to calm her, she spat near his boots and muttered a slur under her breath, an ugly word she had learned from Nazi broadcasts. The camp froze. Even the white guards tensed. Turner looked at her for a long second, expression unreadable. Then, in a voice low and steady, he said, "You've got a choice, ma'am. Keep that hate and let it eat you, or start fresh like the rest of the world's trying to." He turned away without another word. The silence that followed was heavy. Irma lowered her head. The next morning she was seen scrubbing floors alone in the mess tent, her pride gone quiet. Liesl thought about that moment for days. The restraint Turner showed was more powerful than anger. She had seen German officers lose control over far smaller insults, their fury fueled by arrogance. But this man, with all the reasons in the world to hate, refused to be consumed by it. She began to wonder if real strength came not from authority but from dignity. Time moved slowly, yet something was changing inside the camp. The American soldiers, many just boys who wanted to go home, began sharing bits of their world with the prisoners. They taught them small English words. Thank you, please. Bread, coffee. Some even handed out paperbacks left behind by earlier troops. One day, Turner brought a stack of worn magazines to the women assigned to cleaning duty. They're old, he said, setting them on a table. But maybe you'll like the pictures. The magazines were issues of Life and Time, full of faces Lyle had never seen. Smiling people, jazz musicians, movie stars, families at picnics. The images of black Americans standing beside white Americans in advertisements startled her most. In the Reich's posters, such scenes were forbidden. Here, they were normal. Later that evening, she saw Turner sitting under a tarp with another soldier, sharing a canteen. The rain drummed softly above them as they spoke about home. Lissel pretended to tidy up nearby, just to listen. You think they'll remember us back home? The white soldier asked. Turner laughed lightly. Maybe not the way we want. Folks back there still think a man's color decides what kind of hero he can be. His companion shook his head. That's crazy after all we've seen. Turner's tone softened. That's the thing, Joe. Seeing and believing are two different battles. Those words sank deep into Lissel's mind. Seeing and believing. She realized that she, too, had seen the truth long before she believed it. Her eyes had witnessed something her soul was still learning to accept. That equality could exist even in a world built on conquest and pride. In early August, an order came that the camp would host a Red Cross inspection. The prisoners were told to prepare and keep things orderly. For days everyone scrubbed floors, polished pots and repaired fences. The Americans wanted the inspection to go smoothly. When the Red Cross delegate arrived, a Swiss woman with stern eyes, she walked the grounds taking notes. She spoke to a few prisoners, including Lissel. Are you treated fairly? The woman asked in formal German. Lissel hesitated. The easy answer was yes, but the truth was something she had no words for. We are treated better than we thought possible, she said at last. Even by those we were told to hate. The delegate nodded, jotting it down. That night the Americans received commendations for humane conduct. The guards seemed proud, but Turner shrugged off the praise, saying only, "It's how it ought to be." As summer deepened, the war outside the fences began to fade into politics. Germany was divided into occupation zones. Newspapers carried photographs of Nuremberg trials, though few in the camp had access to them. Rumors ran wild about executions, about generals on trial, about a new kind of world order, rising from the ruins. To the prisoners, these events felt distant. Their world was the camp, small, structured, predictable, yet within that confined space, revolutions were quietly taking place in hearts and minds. Lissel found herself talking more often with Turner. When duties overlapped, she asked about America, curious about what kind of country produced such contradictions, where a black man could command respect abroad but face scorn at home. He told her stories of his youth in Georgia, of separate schools and church gatherings, of his mother sewing clothes for white families who never said thank you. I figured the uniform might change something, he said one afternoon, folding laundry near the infirmary. But sometimes I still walk into a diner back home and get told I can fight for freedom but not eat a sandwich. Lissel felt her throat tighten. That is unjust, she said, struggling for the right word. Yeah, he replied, smiling faintly, but it's still home, so I keep trying. That evening she told Inge, her roommate, about the conversation. Inge frowned. You shouldn't talk to them so much. People will think you sympathize. Lissel answered quietly. Maybe sympathy is all that's left for decent people. Autumn crept in, bringing cold mornings and shorter days. The campfires burned lower, the laughter softer. Yet the tension between old prejudice and new understanding still lingered. Some women clung to the old beliefs, whispering that the Americans were pretending, that their kindness was a trick. Others, like Lissel, began to accept that the world had changed. They were living proof that defeat could cleanse the soul as much as it could humiliate it. One morning during inspection, Turner noticed Lissel struggling to lift a heavy crate. He moved forward silently and helped her without a word. She muttered a thank you, embarrassed. He nodded, wiping his hands. You remind me of my sister, he said suddenly. Stubborn like her too. She smiled for the first time in weeks. Then she must be strong, he chuckled. She's stronger than most men I know. Later that day, while cleaning near the mess tent, Lissel overheard two young soldiers arguing. One of them, white and barely 20, complained about sharing a table with colored troops. The sergeant in charge, an older man with a deep voice, cut him short. You think bullets care what color the man beside you is? He saves your life, you'll thank him fast enough. The boy said nothing after that. Liesel thought about how strange it was that even the victors wrestled with their own division. Yet, unlike the Reich, they allowed disagreement without violence. That too was power. The ability to coexist without destruction. By late October, the leaves turned amber and brown, and rumors spread that some prisoners would soon be transferred. Lists were drawn, names posted. Liesel's name wasn't on any yet, which secretly relieved her. The camp had become something like a strange sanctuary, a place where she could unlearn the poisons of her past. On Sundays, when the guards had less work, they sometimes organized gatherings. A few soldiers brought guitars. Others clapped hands, singing songs. Liesel didn't understand but felt deeply. Turner sang too, his voice low and strong. The melody filled the cold air, carrying warmth into the night. Some women listened from a distance, afraid to join. Others hummed along quietly. It was during one such night that Liesel realized how much she had changed. She no longer saw Turner as a soldier, or a symbol. He was simply a man, a kind man who deserved every right to be free. Weeks passed, and the camp began to empty as more women were released or transferred. Each departure brought mixed feelings: relief, fear, gratitude. One afternoon, while distributing medicine, Liesel noticed Turner rubbing his wrist. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "Just a scrape from fixing the fence," he said. She offered to clean it, and he allowed it with quiet humility. Her hands trembled slightly as she dabbed the wound with alcohol. "You've seen worse, haven't you?" she said softly. He nodded. "Worse things heal slower." In that brief moment, Liesel felt the distance between conqueror and conquered vanish completely. She wanted to tell him that she was sorry, not for losing the war but for having believed the lies that made the war possible. Instead, she only said, "Thank you for not hating us." Turner looked at her steadily. "Ma'am, hate's a heavy thing to carry when you're trying to move forward." Later that night, as she lay awake listening to the rain, Liesel thought of those words like a prayer. Hate is heavy. She imagined the whole of Europe bent under that weight, struggling to stand again. Maybe what she had seen in this camp, black and white men eating together, sharing burdens, forgiving each other, wasn't an exception. Maybe it was the first fragile glimpse of what peace could look like if the world learned from its own ruin. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance, and the guards' laughter carried through the night. Liesel closed her eyes, wondering what her brothers would have thought, if they could see what she had seen. Perhaps they would have been shocked, or perhaps, deep down, they would have felt the same quiet relief, that the madness was finally over, and the world, against all odds, was learning how to be human again. The days grew shorter and colder, and the damp chill of late autumn seeped through every crack in the barracks. The war had been over for months, but its echoes still trembled through every life in that camp. Each prisoner carried ghosts that no warmth could chase away, memories of bombings, hunger, and the unbearable silence that followed defeat. Yet amid all that ruin, something fragile had begun to grow. For the first time, Liesel found herself waking not with dread but with curiosity. She wanted to understand the strange new world, where enemies acted with kindness, and where the rules that had governed her thoughts since childhood no longer seemed to hold any power. She continued to work in the infirmary, cleaning instruments, washing linens, and assisting with basic tasks. The American doctor, a kind but weary man from Ohio, often left her in charge when he was busy elsewhere. Turner visited the infirmary almost daily, sometimes to deliver supplies, sometimes just to check on things. He had a quiet presence that seemed to steady the air around him. His politeness was unwavering, but there was something deeper beneath it, an unspoken sadness perhaps, or simply the fatigue of a man who had seen too much and received too little thanks. One morning while restocking the shelves, Lucille asked him about his life in America. "You said your mother was a seamstress," she began hesitantly, her German accent softening her words. "What about your father?" Turner paused, setting a box down before answering. "Didn't know him much," he said. "He worked the railroads for a while, then left when I was little. Mama raised me and my sister by herself. She used to say hard work's the only thing they can't take from you." "That sounds wise," Liesel said. "She was," Turner replied. Couldn't read or write much, but she knew more about people than most preachers. There was a small silence before Liesel spoke again. "And you, why did you join the army?" He looked out the window, watching a group of prisoners hang laundry in the wind. Because I got tired of hearing what I couldn't do, he said. Figured if I wore the uniform maybe folks back home would start seeing the man before the color. Lizel wanted to ask if it had worked but didn't. She already knew the answer from the sadness in his eyes. Days passed like slow-moving clouds. The camp had grown quieter as more prisoners were transferred or released. Fewer guards were needed now, so shifts were longer. Turner began helping with maintenance as well as security. Once, when a water pipe burst near the kitchen, Lizel saw him working late into the evening with a wrench in hand, mud splattering his boots, steam rising from the ground. She stood nearby holding a lantern to help him see. "You don't have to," he said when he noticed her. "It's cold, and this ain't pretty work." "I've seen worse," she replied simply. He smiled at that. The first real smile she had seen from him. It was a small moment, but it lingered in her heart like the faint glow of a dying fire. Over time she began to sense that Turner carried his own quiet rebellion inside him, a refusal to become bitter. The other guards respected him, though some avoided him in that awkward American way of pretending not to see what made them uncomfortable. Lizel sometimes overheard small slights, comments muttered too softly to be reported. Yet Turner never reacted. He simply continued his duties with steady discipline, his dignity unshaken. For Lizel, that dignity was a revelation. It stood in contrast to the arrogance she had once admired in German officers, men who measured pride in medals and cruelty. Turner's pride was quieter but stronger. It came from character, not hierarchy. She thought of her brothers then, both of whom had vanished on the Eastern Front. They had believed they were fighting for honor. Now she wondered if they had ever truly known what honor meant. The first snow came early that year, blanketing the camp in silence. The Americans set up heaters inside the barracks, and for a brief time the place felt almost like a small village instead of a prison. In the evenings the soldiers sometimes gathered around the stoves, sharing coffee and story. The prisoners were allowed to sit nearby, though not too close. One night, Turner joined the group, holding a tin mug between his hands. Someone asked him to tell a story about home. He began to speak, his voice soft and steady. He told them about a summer back in Georgia, when he was 10, picking peaches with his mother in the blazing sun. He described the smell of ripe fruit, the sting of sweat in his eyes, the taste of water pulled from a tin pail. As he spoke, the camp seemed to fade away. For a moment, everyone, prisoners and guards alike, was transported somewhere warm, somewhere peaceful. When he finished, there was a stillness that felt sacred. Lizel found herself blinking back tears. After that night she often caught herself looking for him during the day. Not with the nervousness of a captive, but with the quiet respect one feels for a teacher. She began asking questions whenever she could about America, about the war, about what he thought the future would bring. Sometimes he answered. Other times he just smiled and said, "Future's like a road you can't see past the next bend." One day, a new officer arrived to oversee the camp. He was younger, harsher, the kind of man who believed strictness was the same as discipline. His first act was to order stricter schedules and reduce the prisoners' rations. The mood in the camp shifted immediately. The laughter disappeared. Turner didn't argue, but Lizel could sense his disapproval. One evening she overheard him talking quietly with the doctor. "They've had enough of punishment," he said. "What they need is direction." The officer, walking past, caught part of it and gave him a hard look but said nothing. 2 weeks later, a small incident changed everything. During food distribution, one of the women fainted from hunger and exhaustion. Turner rushed forward to help her, catching her before she hit the ground. The new officer barked orders at him, accusing him of breaking procedure by touching a prisoner. Turner ignored him, carried the unconscious woman to the infirmary, and stayed there until she woke. The officer reported him to the command post. For 2 days the camp waited in uneasy silence to see what would happen. Then word spread that the higher-ups had dismissed the complaint. Turner remained on duty, but the respect the prisoners felt for him deepened even more. After that, Lizel began to feel something she couldn't name, a strange pull between gratitude and guilt. Gratitude for the kindness he had shown, guilt for the years she had spent believing lies about men like him. She wanted to tell him all this, but couldn't. Words felt too fragile for the weight of what she felt. By December the snow was heavy, and the camp lights glowed dimly under the gray sky. Christmas was approaching. The Americans set up a small tree inside their quarters, decorating it with scraps of paper and tin foil. They played music on an old gramophone, soft, crackling songs that drifted across the yard. For many prisoners it was the first sound of peace they had heard in years. The women were given a special meal that night: bread, soup, and even a small piece of chocolate. Turner helped distribute the food, smiling at their surprise. When he handed Leslie her portion, she hesitated before saying, "Merry Christmas." The words felt strange in English, but he smiled and replied, "Merry Christmas, ma'am." Later that evening, as snow fell outside, she found herself sitting by the infirmary stove, staring into the fire. Turner entered quietly, checking supplies. "You miss home?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes. But home is gone." He understood what she meant. "War takes a lot," he said softly. "But it can't take what you learn from it." She looked at him, wondering if he realized how much he had taught her already. That night she wrote in her notebook again, "If someone had told me a year ago that I would learn decency from those we called our enemies, I would have laughed. But now I see that maybe the only real victory is kindness." The new year arrived without celebration. Snow still covered everything, and the camp grew quieter each day as transfers continued. One morning a list was posted outside the command tent, names of those to be moved to a repatriation camp in England. Lesalle's name was on it. She stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to feel relief or sorrow. Part of her longed for home, but another part dreaded leaving this place where she had begun to unlearn the poison of her past. When she told Turner, he only nodded. "Guess you'll be heading home soon," he said. "That's good. I don't know if home still exists," she answered. "It's all ruins now." He didn't argue. "Ruins can still grow flowers," he said simply. Her last few days in the camp passed quickly. She tried to memorize every detail: the sound of boots on gravel, the smell of coffee, the faint hum of a tune Turner often whistled. On her final morning, as the trucks prepared to leave, she found him near the gate. The sky was pale gray, the air sharp with cold. She hesitated before speaking. "You once told me you joined the army to change how people see you. I think you changed how I see the world." Turner looked at her for a long moment. "Maybe that's all any of us can do, change one person at a time." They shook hands, the gesture brief, but heavy with meaning. When she climbed onto the truck, she turned back one last time. He stood there, his breath misting in the cold air, hand raised in farewell. The engine started, the wheels churned through mud, and the camp grew smaller in the distance. Liesl felt something break quietly inside her. Not sadness, but the ache of understanding. As the convoy moved through the countryside, she looked out at the devastated fields and thought of the people she had met. The prisoners, the guards, Turner. She realized that the war had not only destroyed cities, it had destroyed illusion. The world she was returning to would never again look the same. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of that. When they stopped for the night at a transit station, she took out her notebook and wrote by the dim lantern light. "I met a man who should have hated me, but he didn't. He showed me that kindness is not weakness, and that dignity can live even among ashes. If this is what defeat feels like, then maybe defeat is what saves the soul." Outside, the wind howled through the broken windows, carrying the sound of distant bells. Somewhere beyond the darkness, the world was beginning to rebuild itself, one small act of decency at a time. Liesl closed her notebook and leaned against the cold wall, listening to the fading echo of a song she had once heard in the camp, a low, steady hymn that sounded like hope. The journey back to Germany was long and bitter. The trucks carried the former prisoners across the scarred landscape of Europe, past towns that no longer existed, through bridges that creaked under the weight of exhaustion rather than steel. Winter hung heavy over everything. Smoke still rose from villages where the war had left its last scars, and the air smelled faintly of wet ash and burned wood. Liesl sat among the other women, her thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her thoughts caught between memory and the uncertain horizon ahead. She was free now, at least in the way the world measured freedom. But inside she carried the strange weight of something that felt more permanent than captivity, a kind of awakening that had no name. When the convoy reached the edge of the Rhine, the soldiers halted for inspection. The women were herded into a small warehouse for processing. There were British officers there, polite but distant, checking lists and assigning destinations. Liesl handed over her documents without speaking. The officer glanced at her name, nodded, and directed her toward a line marked for Hamburg repatriation. That word, repatriation, felt foreign on her tongue. How could one return to something that no longer existed? The Germany she had known was gone, buried beneath rubble and silence. Yet, as she stepped out into the pale winter sun, she felt the faint pulse of something new beneath the ruin, a whisper of possibility. The days that followed, blurred together, transit camps, ration lines, and the endless shuffle of people searching for loved ones. At one checkpoint, Liesl saw a boy who couldn't have been older than 15, selling bits of metal from broken planes. His eyes were hollow, his clothes too large. She gave him a piece of her bread without thinking, and he took it without a word. It reminded her of Turner's quiet gestures, the same simplicity, the same refusal to let cruelty define what it meant to be human. She found herself looking for signs of him everywhere, as if the lessons he had given her had left invisible footprints across the road home. When she finally reached Hamburg, she barely recognized her city. Whole districts had been flattened by bombing raids. Only the cathedral spire still rose from the dust like a survivor's arm. The house where her parents had lived was gone, reduced to a pile of bricks. A neighbor told her that her mother had died during an air raid in 1943. Of her brothers there was no news. The silence was heavier than any words could have been. She wandered through the ruins for hours, stepping over splintered doors and burned photographs, until she reached what had once been the edge of the Ulster River. The water was gray and still, reflecting the blackened bones of the city. In the weeks that followed, Liesl found work with a relief unit run by the British Red Cross. Her medical training made her useful, and she threw herself into tending to the sick and the displaced. Every day she saw faces that mirrored her own grief. Mothers without sons, children without homes, men who had survived but lost everything worth living for. Yet amid all that despair there were also moments of strange tenderness. A soldier giving his coat to a freezing child, a nurse humming to calm a dying man. These small acts reminded Liesl that the world had not completely gone mad. They were the fragile seeds of something better. She often thought of Turner during those long days in the hospital tents. Whenever she bandaged a wound or poured hot water into a basin, she remembered his patience, the way he had spoken of dignity as though it were a language anyone could learn. She wrote about him in her notebook, the same one she had kept hidden through the war. If he could forgive, she wrote, then so can we. Maybe that is the only way to rebuild anything. Years passed in fragments. The rubble was cleared, brick by brick. New walls rose from the ruins, though the air still carried the smell of loss. Liesl grew older but not hardened. She worked tirelessly in hospitals across northern Germany, helping to train new nurses. Her calm voice and unyielding fairness earned her quiet respect. When asked about the war, she rarely spoke, but when she did, she chose her words carefully. The war taught me that a nation's strength is not in its armies, she would say, but in how it treats those it no longer fears. In 1952, a letter arrived at her small apartment. The envelope was marked with a blue American stamp, and her name was written in careful handwriting that she did not recognize. She opened it cautiously. "Ma'am," it began. "I don't know if you remember me, but my name is James Turner. I was one of the soldiers stationed at the POW camp near Reims. I came across your name through a veterans exchange program that helps former prisoners and guards reconnect. I hope this letter finds you well. The world's changed a lot since then. I live in Chicago now, teaching at a small school. Sometimes I tell my students about those days in France, about how a war meant to divide us showed me how much we share instead. But I just wanted you to know that kindness never gets lost. It echoes." Liesl read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling. She sat down at her desk and began to write back that same evening. "Corporal Turner," she wrote, "I do remember you. I think about that camp often, and how it changed everything I believed about people. Your words that day, 'Hate is a heavy thing to carry,' have stayed with me always. I wish I could tell you that the world has learned from all this, but I still see how easily people forget. Yet I have hope because I met someone like you." They continued writing for years, their letters slow but constant, crossing the ocean like small lifeboats of memory. He told her about his students, about the struggles of Black Americans still fighting for equality. She told him about post-war Germany, about the slow work of rebuilding hearts, as well as homes. Sometimes they spoke of their shared past, but more often they spoke of the future of what could still be built if people chose compassion over pride. Each letter ended the same way: "Keep believing, Rachel." In the late 1960s, as the world changed again with protests, civil rights marches, and the shadow of new wars, Liesl followed the news from America closely. She saw photographs of Black men and women standing in front of police lines, their faces filled with the same quiet strength she remembered in Turner. When she wrote to him about it, he replied, "It's a long road, ma'am, but we're still walking it, just like you." As the years turned into decades, the letters grew fewer, but each one carried a warmth that transcended the distance between them. By the time Liesl was in her 70s, her hands had grown stiff from arthritis, but she still kept Turner's letters neatly tied with string in a drawer by her bedside. Sometimes she would read them aloud to herself on quiet evenings. The ink faded, but the meaning eternal. In 1995, a journalist from a television network visited her nursing home. They were interviewing survivors and witnesses for a documentary marking 50 years since the end of the war. Liesel hesitated at first. She had never liked attention, but eventually agreed. She sat in a small room with bright lights and a camera pointed at her face. The interviewer asked gentle questions. Where she had been during the war, what she had seen, what she remembered most. When they asked about the prison camp, she took a long breath before answering. "I saw something there that changed me," she said. "I saw black and white American soldiers sitting together, sharing food. That was the first time I understood what equality really meant. We were taught that the world was divided by race and worth. But that day I saw something stronger than hate. Ordinary decency." The interviewer leaned forward. "What did you feel when you saw that?" "At first," she said slowly, "I felt fear, because everything I had believed was falling apart. But then I felt peace. It was like watching a door open in a wall that had stood my whole life." Her words aired a few weeks later in a short segment on German television. She received dozens of letters afterward, some from former POWs, others from teachers and young students who had watched the interview in school. They thanked her for speaking honestly, for reminding them that humanity was not a victory won once, but a lesson that must be learned again and again. One day, a letter arrived without a return address. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. "Dear Liesel," it read, "I saw the interview. You look just like I remember. Maybe wiser, maybe gentler. I'm proud to know you. This world still struggles. But if we could share one table back then, maybe there's hope yet. I'm not as strong as I used to be, but I still hum that hymn sometimes. You once said it sounded like forgiveness. I think maybe it was. Jane." Liesel folded the letter carefully and held it to her chest. She never heard from him again after that, but she kept that letter beside his first one, tied together with ribbon. Some nights she dreamed of the camp, not as a place of barbed wire and fences, but as a small island of decency in a sea of chaos. She dreamed of the laughter of soldiers, of the smell of coffee, of the sight of Turner standing in the cold morning light, clipboard in hand, nodding at her name as if it mattered. Years later, when she passed away peacefully in her sleep, her niece found the letters bundled neatly in the drawer. She brought them to a museum in Berlin that collected personal stories from the war. Today, those letters rest behind glass, under the title "Bridges Across the Divide." Visitors stopped to read them, many leaving in silence, some with tears in their eyes. In one of her last letters, Liesel had written a line that the museum later chose to engrave beneath the display. "The war taught us how to destroy. The peace taught us how to forgive. I once believed humanity could be divided by color, but I learned that kindness has none. The truest victory is to share a table with those you were taught to hate." Outside that quiet museum, children now play in streets rebuilt from the ruins she once walked through. The world she helped nurse back to life still carries its scars, but it also carries her lesson. Carved not into monuments of stone, but into the unseen corners of human memory. Somewhere across the ocean, perhaps under a different sky, the echo of a low hymn lingers still, the same one Turner once hummed while carrying supplies through the mud of a forgotten camp. It drifts quietly through time, a song without words, a reminder that dignity once given never truly dies.